Intelligence. Chapter 4. Africans. 1. Intelligence of Africans in Sub-Saharan Africa. 2. University students in Africa. 3. Africans in the Caribbean and Latin America. 4. African Americans in the United States. 5. Africans in Britain. 6. Africans in the Netherlands. 7. Africans in Israel. 8. Short-term memory and perceptual speed abilities of Africans. 9. Musical abilities. 10. Reaction times. 11. Brain size. 12. African-European hybrids. 13. Heritability of intelligence in African Americans. 14. Environmental and genetic explanations of African-European IQ differences. 15. Estimation of the genotypic African IQ. He term Africans von S used here for the principal indigenous peoples of sub-indigenous to Africa north of the Sahara, from the Pygmies, and from the Bushmen or Khoisans, the other race in sub-Saharan Africa, of whom only a few tens of thousands now survive, principally in the Kalahari Desert and as Hottentots in South Africa. A variety of terms have been used for the African peoples, including A for Ethiopians and Negroids. Whatever the name used, the Africans have always been regarded as one of the major races in the taxonomies of classical anthropology, including that of Linnaeus, Blumenbach, and Kuhn, Garn, and Birdsell. Cavalli, Sforza, Minozzi, and Piazza have confirmed the distinctive genetic characteristics of the Africans in their classification of humans into genetic clusters, in which these peoples were represented by West Africans of the region, west of Nigeria Nilotics of the Upper Nile in southern Sudan Ethiopians, and Bantus, a large group present in most of sub-Saharan Africa, from Nigeria in the west to Kenya. The most distinctive features of Africans are their very dark skin, dark eyes, broad nose, thick everted lips, and woolly hair. Their blood groups differ from Europeans in having a lower frequency of Group A, which is present in about 27% as compared with around 46% in Europeans, and a higher frequency of Group B, which is present in about 34% as compared with around 14% in Europeans. 1. Intelligence of Africans in Sub-Saharan Africa. The first attempt to estimate the intelligence of Africans was made by Galton on the basis of his own experience of them during his travels in Southwest Africa and the accounts of other travelers. He constructed a scale of grades of intelligence in which one grade was equivalent to 10.425 IQ points on the IQ scale. He estimated that Africans were about 2 grades below the English, giving them an IQ of 79. Subsequent studies of the IQs of general population samples of Africans in sub-Saharan Africa have shown that this estimate overestimated the African IQ by slightly over 1 grade. Studies of the IQs of Africans in sub-Saharan Africa are summarized in Table 4.1. Explanations of the results set out in the table are given when appropriate. Row 1 gives an IQ of 64 for Cameroon for adult workers. Row 2 gives an IQ of 64 for the Central African Republic for young men applying for a technical training course at a college in the city of Bangui during the years 1951 to 1955. Rows 3 through 5 give IQs of 64 for samples from Congo-Brazzaville collected at the same time in the cities of Brazzaville and Pointe-Noire. Rows 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 give IQs of 68 and 65 for Congo-Zaire. Row 11 gives an IQ of 59 for Equatorial Guinea. Row 12 gives an IQ of 80 for adults in Ghana. The IQ is exceptionally high for sub-Saharan Africa, possibly because the sample came from the capital city of Accra. The people in capital cities typically have higher IQs than those in the rest of the country, probably because there is a tendency for more intelligent individuals to migrate to the capital. IQs in London and Paris are higher than in the rest of Britain and France. Row 13 gives an IQ of 62 for a representative sample drawn from the whole. Table 4.1. IQs of Africans in sub-Saharan Africa, of Ghana. Rows 14 and 15 give IQs of 63 and 70 obtained in 2 studies for Guinea. Rows 16 through 21 give IQs of 69, 75, 69, 76, 89, and 63 for Kenya. The IQ of 89 in row 20 for a sample of 7-year-olds tested in 1998 is much higher than the other figures in the IQ of 76 found by the same investigators in their 1984 study and than any other IQ in sub-Saharan African populations. Its disparity from the other studies makes its validity questionable because the IQ of 75 given in row 17 is obtained from a standardization of the same test for the whole of Kenya carried out in the same year, and the IQ of 69 given in row 19 was also obtained in the same year. These two IQs are typical of those obtained throughout sub-Saharan Africa and are credible, but they cast doubt on the IQ of 89. Furthermore, the gain of 15 IQ points from an IQ of 76 to 89 over the 14-year period is uniquely high in studies of the secular rise of IQs and cannot be accepted as credible. Further, it is difficult to believe that children in Kenya can have a higher IQ than African Americans in the United States, where the IQ has remained constant at approximately 85 since the 1920s, but where the living standards and nutrition of Africans are much higher than in Kenya. For these reasons, the reported IQ of 89 for Kenya is considered unreliable. The IQ of 63 given in row 21 is an average of 65 for 6-year-olds at school and 60-1 for those not at school, suggesting that the effect of schooling is to raise the IQ by 4 points. Row 22 gives an IQ of 82 for Madagascar. Although usually counted as part of sub-Saharan Africa, the population of the island includes a significant number of Southeast Asians, originally from Indonesia, who migrated to the island about the 1st century AD. The population also contains Africans and hybrids of the two races. The proportions of the three groups in the population are not precisely known, although it is believed that African ancestry predominates. The mean IQ of 82 is higher than that of any of the samples of the Africans in sub-Saharan Africa given in Table 4.1 except for the questionable 89% for Kenya given in row 20. The population's IQ is intermediate between that of around 65% to 70% of Africans and around 87% of Southeast Asians, although somewhat closer to that of Africans, as would be expected for a Southeast Asian and African mixed-race population in which African genes predominate. There is no apparent environmental explanation for why the IQ of the population of Madagascar should be higher than that throughout mainland sub-Saharan Africa. Row 23 gives an IQ of 64 for Mozambique. This sample had a mean of 3.5 years schooling and included some individuals from Transkei and Malawi. Row 24 gives an IQ of 70 for Nigeria obtained for children, age not given, attending schools in the town of Zaria. An elite sample of boys at grammar school in the same town obtained an IQ of 81. The test was the Lyon test and is described by the author as devised by an African for African children. The result belies the assertion often made that Africans are handicapped on tests constructed by Europeans. Rows 25 and 26 give IQs of 64 and 69 for two further studies in Nigeria. Rows 27 and 28 give IQs of 64 for two samples of adults in Sierra Leone. Row 29 gives an IQ of 65, obtained in the first study of the intelligence of Africans in South Africa carried out in the 1920s. Rows 30 through 41 give IQs in the range between 58 and 77, obtained in 12 later studies. Row 35 gives an IQ of 71 for prison warders who had had between 9 to 12 years of education. Row 36 gives an IQ of 77, which is the highest for general population samples in sub-Saharan Africa but was obtained from the Draw-Aman test, which is a rather poor test of general intelligence. Row 39 gives an IQ of 58 for a large sample of 16-year-old Africans in school who had completed approximately 10 years schooling. The comparison is with South African Europeans. Row 40 gives an IQ of 69 for a sample of adults described as competent men, all in long-standing employment in a sophisticated environment. Row 41 gives an IQ of 68 for adolescents with a few years of schooling in the northern Transvaal. Rows 42 and 43 give IQs of 67 and 64 for samples of adolescents at school in Soweto. Row 44 gives an IQ of 67 for third-grade Zulu school children in Natal. Row 45 gives an IQ of 69 for Sudan obtained for Shilluk children and adolescents described as one of the primitive Nilotic Negro tribes in the southern Sudan. The IQ given is the mean of 4 tests, the Goddard and Porteous Mazes, Alexander Passalong, and Drawman. Rows 46, 47, and 48 give IQs of 64, 74, and 73 for 3 further studies in the Sudan. Row 49 gives an IQ of 78 for a sample of secondary school students in Tanzania and is exceptionally high for African samples. The author of the study explains that the reason for this is that the sample was highly selected because the number of places in secondary school is extremely limited and eligibility is determined by competitive examination. The high IQ of this sample cannot be regarded as representative. The result is informative insofar as it shows that an elite sample at secondary school has an IQ of 78, and this suggests that the IQs in the range of 65 to 72, typically found in sub-Saharan Africa, are valid. Rows 50 and 51 give IQs of 65 and 72 for 2 more representative samples in Tanzania and are consistent with those typical in sub-Saharan Africa. Row 52 gives an IQ of 80 for Uganda for a selective sample of school children described by Vernon as much superior to the East African population in general. This explains why the IQ is higher than that of representative samples in sub-Saharan Africa. Row 53 gives an IQ of 73 for a large and representative sample of Ugandan children. Rows 54 and 55 give IQs of 77 and 64 for Zambia. Rows 56 and 57 give IQs of 61 and 70 for Zimbabwe obtained by Zindi, an African psychologist at the University of Zimbabwe. The most striking feature of the IQs of Africans in sub-Saharan Africa is that they are consistently so much lower than those of Europeans set out in Table 3.1 of Chapter 3. The median IQ is 67 and is adopted as the best estimate of the IQ of Africans, with the exceptions of the IQ of 82 for Madagascar, which is the highest in the table because of the Southeast Asian element in the population, and the IQs of 78 for the elite secondary sample in Tanzania and 80% for the elite secondary sample in Uganda, and the questionable 89 for Kenya. All the IQs fall in the range of 59 to 77, while all the European Caucasoid IQs fall in the range of 87 to 105. There is no overlap between the IQs of the two populations. The variations of the African IQs do not appear to vary by geographical location and are probably attributable to sampling and measurement errors. The IQ of Africans has not shown any change since the first study published by Fick obtained an IQ of 65 for Africans in South Africa. The 4 most recent studies of Africans in South Africa carried out in the 1990s found virtually identical IQs of 69, 68, 67, and 64. 2. University students in Africa. 12 studies have been reported of the intelligence of African university students in South Africa. Some of these also give IQs of European students tested at the same time. The studies are summarized in Table 4.2. Row 1 gives an IQ of 75 for African students at Legon University in Ghana tested with the block design test from the Wechsler test. All the remaining rows give results for South Africa. Row 2 gives an IQ of 84 for African and 103 for European university students calculated in relation to American adult norms, given in Raven, Court, and Raven. Rows 3 and 4 give results for students on the blocks test and gives the IQs of Africans in relation to South African European student norms of 100. Row 5 gives results for the WASAR for students with an average age of 25 years at the African universities of Fort Hare, Zululand, the North, and the Medical University of South Africa. The verbal IQ was 78, and the performance IQ 73 showing once again that the Africans have low IQs in all major cognitive abilities, and disconfirming the claim sometimes made that Africans are handicapped in language tasks. Row 6 gives an IQ of 100 for science students at the University of the North. Row 7 gives an IQ of 77 for students at a less prestigious African university. Row 8 gives an IQ of 83 for students at the University of the Witwatersrand and the Rand Afrikaans University in Johannesburg. Row 9 gives an IQ of 82 for African students at the Venda University in the Northern Transvaal. The comparison European group was at the University of Tilburg in the Netherlands. Row 10 gives an IQ of 81 for psychology students at the University of the Witwatersrand. Row 11 gives an IQ of 93 for first-year engineering students at the University of the Witwatersrand. Row 12 gives an IQ of 99 for a slightly reduced number of the same students who took the advanced progressive matrices 16 months later. Both Africans and Europeans obtained IQs approximately 6 points higher on the second testing, probably as a practice effect. Row 13 gives an IQ of 101 for a further sample of African engineering students at the University of the Witwatersrand, and shows that the African students scored 15 IQ points lower than the European whites. The mean IQs of general student samples shown in rows 1 to 5 and 7 to 9 all fall in the narrow range of 72 to 84, with a median of 81. The IQs of 100 in row 6, 93 in row 11, and 99 in row 12 are higher than the others because they are for science and engineering students who were admitted to the universities on the basis of their performance in entrance tests of mathematics and physics. And these normally have higher reasoning ability than students in most other academic disciplines. For instance, in Iran, 18-year-olds studying math scored 10 IQ points higher than those studying literature. In Britain, education students with degrees in science scored 9 IQ points higher than those with degrees in arts. The IQs of European students in South Africa are in the range between 100 and 105 and are about the same as those of European students in other countries. The interest of these results is that they show that typical African students who have had some 12 years of school and have gained entry to university obtain IQs in the range of 72 to 84. Since these are an African cognitive elite, these results suggest that the IQ of about 70% for the general population is valid and about right. The results also show that IQs of African students in South Africa are on average about 20 IQ points lower than those of European students, and that a considerable gap between the IQs of Africans and Europeans remains when they are matched for years of education. African university students have had 10 to 12 years of formal education, but apart from those studying math and physics, obtain IQs in the range of 72 to 84. Their IQs are some 10 to 12 IQ points higher than the African average because they are a select group. Table 4.2. IQs of African and European university students in Africa. 3. Africans in the Caribbean and Latin America. Studies of the IQs of Africans in the Caribbean and Latin America are summarized in Table 4.3. Row 1 gives an IQ of 80. For children in Barbados, this figure has been calculated from the IQ of 83 of well-nourished children, and 68% of malnourished children reported in the study, weighted by the results of a 1968 survey, finding a prevalence of moderate and severe malnutrition in preschool children in Barbados of 16.5%. Row 2 gives an IQ of 70 for Africans in Brazil attending school in a favela in Brasilia. Row 3 gives an IQ of 64 for the mothers of these children. Row 4 gives an IQ of 71 for Africans in Sao Paulo in Brazil. Row 5 gives an IQ of 67. Table 4.3. IQs of Africans in the Caribbean and Latin America. For 3-year-old African children in Dominica, the low IQ of these infants suggests that poor education is not a factor responsible for the low IQs of Africans in the Caribbean. Rows 6 through 12 give IQs from 7 studies of the IQ in Jamaica in the range of 60 to 75, with a median of 67. Row 13 gives an IQ of 60 for 4-year-olds in St. Lucia, and row 14 an IQ of 70 for children in St. Vincent. The median of the 14 studies of intelligence of Africans in the Caribbean and Latin America is an IQ of 71. This is slightly higher than the median IQ of 67% of Africans in sub-Saharan Africa. The explanation for this may be that Africans in the Caribbean and Latin America have some admixture of genes from Europeans. It has been estimated that the proportion of European genes in the African population of Jamaica is 6.8%. 4. African Americans in the United States. There have been many hundreds of studies of the intelligence of African Americans in the United States. The most important of these are summarized in Table 4.4. Row 1 gives results of the first major study based on military conscripts in World War I, tested with the combined Army Alpha and Beta tests that measured nonverbal and verbal IQs, and from which the later Wechsler tests were constructed. The number of Europeans was 93,973. Row 2 gives results for military conscripts in World War II, and Row 3 the results of military conscripts for the Vietnam War. It is noteworthy that the mean IQ of 77% of Africans is lower in World War II and the Vietnam War than in World War I, and is also lower than the average IQ of 85 it is generally given for the mean IQ of African Americans in the United States. Rows 4 through 7 give results of Shuey's compilation of all American studies. Row 4 gives an IQ of 87 derived from 17 studies of preschool children. Row 5 gives an IQ of 85 derived from 26 studies of primary school children using individual tests such as the Stanford, Binet. Row 6 gives an IQ of 85 for primary school children derived from 103 studies for group tests of verbal ability and 41 studies of group tests of nonverbal ability. Row 7 gives an IQ of 85 for high school students. Rows 8, 9, and 10 give the results of Osborne and McGurk's updated summary of American studies published during 1976 through 1980. Row 8 gives an IQ of 80, derived from 66 studies of preschool 3 to 5-year-olds. Row 9 gives an IQ of 87, derived from 126 studies of primary school children, and Row 10, an IQ of 87, derived from 17 studies of high school students. Rows 11, 12, and 13 give results for large samples not included in the Osborne and McGurk review. Row 11 gives an IQ of 85 for African mothers tested in the National Collaborative Perinatal Project. Table 4.4. IQs of African Americans in the United States. And rows 12 and 13 give IQs of 87 for their children at the age of 4 years and 7 years. Row 14 gives a GIQ of 86 for Africans from the standardization sample of the WISC-R. Row 15 gives IQs of 81 for G, 86 for verbal, and 84 for visualization for employed individuals collected by the United States Employment Service. Row 16 gives African American IQs of 85 for G, 87 for verbal, and 86 for visualization for a sample in California. Row 17 gives IQs of 85 for G, 87 for verbal ability, and 86 for visualization ability, obtained from the standardization sample of the WISC-R. Row 18 gives an IQ of 82 from the AFQT. Row 19 gives an IQ of 93 from the standardization sample of the KABC. Row 20 gives a vocabulary IQ of 85 from the standardization sample of the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test. Row 21 gives an IQ of 83 from the standardization sample of the Stanford Binet 4. In this sample, African Americans obtained a short-term memory IQ of 89, consistent with a number of other studies finding they do relatively well on short-term memory. Row 22 gives an IQ of 85 for 3-year-olds from the standardization sample of the Stanford Binet LM. Row 23 gives an IQ of 83 calculated from the first principal component as a measure of G obtained from military personnel. Row 24 gives an IQ of 85 from the standardization sample of the WISC-3. Row 25 gives an IQ of 88 from the standardization sample of the Kaufman Adolescent and Adult Intelligence Test. Row 26 gives an IQ of 81 for a sample of employed individuals collected by the United States Employment Service. Row 27 gives a visualization IQ of 85, derived from the block design subtest of the WISC-R, obtained from the National NHANES 3 sample. Row 28 gives an IQ of 85 for infants aged 3 to 3.4 years from the standardization sample of the Stanford Binet 4. Row 29 gives an IQ of 85 for a representative sample aged 70 and older from the continental United States. Row 30 gives an IQ of 90 for vocabulary for African adults obtained in the NORC surveys for 1990 to 96 from a representative sample from the continental United States. This unusually high figure is attributable to the shortness of the test, consisting of defining the meaning of 10 words. Row 31 gives an IQ of 87 from the 1992 National Adult Literacy Survey, a test consisting of verbal comprehension and arithmetic administered to a representative sample from the continental United States. There are 5 conclusions to be drawn from the studies of the intelligence of African Americans. First, the median IQ is 85 and is widely accepted as the best estimate of the African American IQ. This estimate is close to the 83.5 obtained by Roth, Bevier, Bobko, Switzer, and Tyler from a meta-analysis of 105 studies based on 6,246,729 individuals. The variations in the means obtained in different studies are probably due to sampling, measurement errors, and differences in the abilities measured in different tests. It has been shown in many studies that Africans do relatively well in tests of memory, so the size of the African-European difference reflects to some degree the extent to which memory tests are represented in the IQs. For instance, one of the higher IQs in the table is the 88% obtained in Kaufman's CATE. This test contains 7 subtests, of which one is a memory for faces test that requires the identification of the faces of famous people. On this subtest, Africans obtained a mean IQ of 92.5. Second, the African American IQ of approximately 85 appears in children aged 3, as can be seen in rows 22 and 28. These results tell against the theory, often advanced by environmentalists, that poor education and racism are responsible for or contribute to the low IQ of Africans. Even among 2-year-olds, Africans have an IQ of 92. This is not so low as in the other studies because African infants mature earlier than Europeans up to the age of 2 years. It is not until their 3rd year that their IQs fall below that of Europeans, and only in their 4th year that their IQ declines to reach their IQ of approximately 85. As shown in rows 22 and 28. Third, the IQ of approximately 85% of African Americans is substantially higher than the average IQ of 67% of Africans in sub-Saharan Africa. 2 factors can explain this difference. The first is that American Africans enjoy a better environment than Africans in Africa in a number of respects, including much higher living standards and better nutrition and health. The second is that African Americans have on average about 25% of European ancestry, and this increases their IQs above that of Africans in Africa. Fourth, in the 5 studies giving verbal and visualization IQs, American Africans score 1 or 2 points higher on the verbal IQs. The verbal IQs appear to be more culturally biased, so this tells against the theory often proposed by environmentalists that Africans perform poorly because the tests are biased against them. This confirms the conclusions reached by McGurk that African Americans are not more impaired on what were considered culturally biased general information problems, and by Jensen that tests are not biased against African Americans. Fifth, there appears to have been no improvement in the IQs of African Americans over the course of the 20th century. Thus, the median IQ of the 14 studies carried out from 1980 to 1998 is 85. The same as that of the earlier studies. This conclusion is confirmed by the absence of any tendency for the African American-European difference to be smaller. In younger age groups, African-European IQ differences at different ages have been reported by Reynolds, Chastain, Kaufman, and Mack, lean for the WISC-R standardization sample collected in 1978. The African IQs are 86 in 16 to 19-year-olds, 85 for 20 to 34 and 35 to 54-year-olds, and 86 for 55 to 74-year-olds. It has also been shown in bi-yearly data that there has been no difference in African American European intelligence over the period 1974 to 1996. Finally, in the standardization sample of the CATE, there was no significant difference between the youngest and oldest age groups. In fact, the youngest age group, born between 1980 and 1991, had a slightly lower IQ of 83 compared with an IQ of 88 of the oldest age group, born on average in 1921. 5. Africans in Britain. Africans began to migrate to Britain in substantial numbers shortly after the end of World War II. The first immigrants came mainly from the Caribbean, and in the last quarter of the 20th century, a number came from Africa. From the 1960s, studies were published of the IQs of African immigrants. The results of these are given in Table 4.5. Row 1 gives an IQ of 88 for what is believed to be the first published result of the children of West Indian Africans, and is for a sample of Caribbean children in London, where the majority of these immigrants settled. Row 2 gives an IQ of 82, calculated by Vernon for another sample in London in the 1960s. Row 3 gives a reasoning IQ of 88 and a vocabulary IQ of 82 for West Indian children compared with European English children attending the same secondary school in the district of Haringey in London. The district is poor, and the European children will have scored below the national average, thereby inflating the IQs of the West Indians. To adjust for this, the IQ of the Europeans is assumed to be 95. Row 4 gives an IQ of 89 for a sample of children in London. Row 5 gives an IQ of 86 for samples of children in Birmingham and in Deptford, London. Row 6 gives an IQ of 104 for 9 African children, taken into institutions as infants, because their mothers were unable to look after them. In the same study, the IQs of mixed-race children and white children also taken into institutions were measured, with the results that the mixed race had an IQ of 110 and the whites an IQ of 104. The results are out of line with the other results in the table, all of which show African children in Britain have IQs well below whites. Moreover, it would normally be expected that the IQs of the children would be below average intelligence, because the mothers were predominantly unskilled and put them into institutions, and would probably have been of below average intelligence. The results that these children had IQs above average are remarkable and need replication. If they can be confirmed as valid, they suggest that black mothers do not provide such a good environment as the white foster parents who reared these children, but there is little evidence to support this inference. The number of children was very small, and possibly this is just a fluke result. Row 7 gives an IQ of 86 for a national sample of Afro-Caribbean children in Britain. Rows 8 and 9 give IQs of 73 for children in Britain born in the Caribbean, and of 82 for those born in Britain. The IQ of 73 for those born in the Caribbean is closely similar to that of 71% of indigenous Caribbean children, given in Table 4.2. Row 10 gives a verbal IQ of 86 for West Indian children, tested with the English Picture Vocabulary Test. Row 11 gives an IQ of 85 for West Indian children at a comprehensive school in the town of Ilford in Essex. The IQ of 85 is lower than that of Indian subcontinent children in the same school who obtained an IQ of 91. This is the first of a number of studies in Britain finding that Caribbean immigrants have lower IQs than Indian immigrants from the subcontinent. Row 12 gives a vocabulary IQ of 78 for all West Indian children at maintained schools in an education authority in the Midlands. Row 13 gives an IQ of 86, derived from a reading test on a very large national sample of 12,530 15-year-olds. Row 14 gives an IQ of 85 obtained on a vocabulary test by West Indian children in the north of England compared with 851 Europeans attending the same schools. Row 15 gives an IQ of 86 obtained by West Indian children at school in a town in the Midlands. Indians from the Indian subcontinent attending the same schools obtained an IQ of 96. Showing once again that South Asians in the same environment as Africans obtain higher IQs. Row 16 gives an IQ of 90 for a sample of West Indian children in London. Row 17 gives an IQ of 87 for a sample of West Indian 4-year-olds. Row 18 gives an IQ of 89 for a national sample of Caribbean children, drawn from the whole of Britain born in 1958, and who had been in Britain for more than 4 years. A further group of 39 who had been in Britain for fewer than 4 years obtained an IQ of 83, suggesting that residence in Britain raises the IQs of Caribbean children by around 6 IQ points. It has sometimes been suggested that many of the recent immigrant children from the Caribbean spoke a form of Creole West Indian English that made it hard for them to understand the teachers, but the fact that immigrant West Indians performed about the same on nonverbal reasoning tests as on verbal comprehension makes this unlikely. Row 19 gives an IQ of Table 4.5. IQs of Africans in Britain. 92 for a national British sample born in 1970. The high IQ of this sample may indicate that the IQ of Caribbean children has increased slightly, but the subsequent studies in the table show no improvement in the IQs of African children from the 1960s through the 1980s, so this may be a chance result. Row 20 gives an IQ of 88 for a sample of African school children in schools in London, the majority of whom had been born in Britain. Row 21 gives an IQ of 92 for a sample of African school children in Cambridgeshire. The IQs are in relation to indigenous British children attending the same schools, and these are likely to be below national norms because the British of higher socioeconomic status tend not to send their children to schools where there are appreciable numbers of immigrants. The effect of this will be to inflate the IQs of the Africans. There are no national norms for the test, so the IQ of the Africans in relation to British cannot be accurately calculated. Probably the IQ of the British in this study was about 95, and hence the IQ of the African sample in relation to British national norms will have been about 87, and therefore about the same as other samples of Africans in Britain. Row 22 gives an IQ of 89 for a sample of 65 to 75-year-old Africans in London, obtained in 1996 to 98, compared with a national sample of 5,379 indigenous British. The results of the studies of the intelligence of Africans in Britain raise 3 points of interest. First, the median IQ of the studies is 86 and is almost exactly the same as the average of 85% of Africans in the United States. These figures are substantially higher than the median IQ of 67% of Africans in sub-Saharan Africa and of 71% in the Caribbean, from where most Africans in Britain have come in the post-World War II decades. Second, the higher IQ of Africans in Britain is attributable to the better environment. This effect is shown in the study by Ewell, Berger, Rutter, and Ewell, given in rows 7 and 8, showing IQs of 73 for those born in the West Indies and 82 for those born in Britain, suggesting that residence in Britain raises the IQs of Caribbean children by around 9 IQ points. This result is confirmed by the McIntosh and Massey-Taylor study shown in row 18, where the West Indian children from the Caribbean, who had been in Britain for more than 4 years, had an IQ of 89, while the IQ of a further group of 39 who had been in Britain for fewer than 4 years obtained an IQ of 83, suggesting that residence in Britain raises the IQs of Caribbean children by around 6 IQ points. The two results are quite similar, suggesting that being raised in Britain increases the IQs of Africans by 7 to 8 IQ points. This increase is probably largely a result of better nutrition and healthcare, and perhaps education, although there seems to be no evidence that education in the West Indies is poorer than in Britain, and is sometimes asserted to be better. The effect of improved nutrition for West Indian immigrants was shown by the Ewell et al. Study that found that West Indian Africans born in Britain are taller than those born in the Caribbean who had come to Britain sometime during childhood, a difference of 0.67d. Third, the IQ of 87 for a sample of West Indian 4-year-olds given in row 17 is virtually exactly the same as that obtained by older West Indian children at school, and shows that the low IQs of West Indian children cannot be blamed on schools, prejudice of teachers, difficulties understanding teachers, spoken English, and so on. This result confirms those found in the United States, that the low IQ of Africans is present in preschool children. 6. Africans in TBE Netherlands. During the second half of the 20th century, a number of Africans migrated to the Netherlands from the former Dutch colony of Suriname in the northeast of South America and from the Netherlands Antilles, the former Dutch colony in the Caribbean. Studies of their intelligence are summarized in Table 4.6. Row 1 gives an IQ of 86 for the children of immigrants from Suriname. The test used and the age of the sample are not given. The population of Suriname consists of 35% Creoles of mixed African-European ancestry, 10% Africans, 33% Asian Indian, 16% Indonesian, and 3% American Indian. The IQ of 86 is about what would be predicted from this racially mixed population because the largest group, the Creoles, would be expected to have an IQ about midway between Africans in Africa and Northwest Europeans, and the second largest group, the Asian Indians, should have an IQ of approximately 82. Row 2 gives an IQ of 84 for a sample of the children of first-generation immigrants from Suriname and the Netherlands Antilles. Row 3 gives an IQ of 88 for a sample of the children of second-generation immigrants from Suriname and the Netherlands Antilles. These children have a 4 IQ point gain compared with the children of first-generation immigrants shown in Row 2. This confirms the studies in Britain showing that second-generation immigrants obtain higher IQs than first-generation. Row 4 gives an IQ of 85 for a further sample of the children of immigrants from Suriname. The test used and the age of the sample are not given. Row 5 gives an IQ of 83 for another sample of immigrants from Suriname and the Netherlands Antilles. Row 6 gives an IQ of 85 for adult immigrants from Suriname. Row 7 gives an IQ of 85 for immigrants from the Dutch Antilles whose population is 85% African and mixed African-European. The IQs obtained in the studies are closely similar, with a median of 85 the same as that of Africans in the United States. Table 4.6. IQs of Africans in the Netherlands. 7. Africans in Israel. A number of African Ethiopian Jews migrated to Israel during the closing decades of the 20th century. The intelligence of a sample of 25,015-year-olds was assessed by Kaniel and Fisherman using the standard progressive matrices. The authors write, "The Ethiopian Jews were tested 1 year after they arrived in Israel. All the subjects were tested in groups in their schools using standard procedure. Each group was shown the first practice item of the test and solved it together. Special care was taken to make sure the Ethiopian Jews understood how the test was organized, to ensure their ability to fill out the answer sheet. There was no time limit. The authors made errors in the calculation of the IQ of the Ethiopians. I have given the correct figures in Lin. The mean score on the test was 27, equivalent to the first percentile on the British 1979 standardization norms, and to an IQ of 65. It is assumed that the Israeli data were collected in 1989, and that the British IQ increased by 2 IQ points between 1979 and 1989. To adjust for this increase, the IQ of the Ethiopian Jews needs to be reduced to 63%. A second study of the IQ of Ethiopian Jews has been published by Kozelin. These were 14 to 16-year-olds who had been in Israel 4 or more years, were attending Israeli boarding schools, and were tested with the progressive matrices. Their mean IQ was 65. These results suggest that education in Western schools does not benefit the African IQ. 8. Short-term memory and perceptual speed abilities of Africans. Hitherto, African intelligence has been considered in terms of reasoning, verbal, and visualization abilities. We now consider studies on the short-term memory and perceptual speed ability of Africans. Short-term memory is typically measured by the digit span test, consisting of the ability to recall a series of numbers either in the order in which they are presented or in reverse order. Perceptual speed is typically measured by the coding and digit symbol subtests in the Wechsler tests that require accurate and rapid scanning of visual information. These studies have shown that Africans have relatively strong short-term memory and perceptual speed abilities. The results are summarized in Table 4.7. Row 1 gives IQs of 75 and 76 for African 10 to 12-year-olds compared with Europeans obtained for nonverbal reasoning, and for verbal ability measured by the Lorge-Thorndike test. A much higher IQ of 90 for short-term memory measured by digit span, and a remarkable IQ of 102 for perceptual speed. The authors comment, given a test that involves only speed but no appreciable cognitive factor, the Negro children perform as well as or better than the European children. Row 2 gives a typical IQ of 85 for the verbal and performance scales of the WISC-R obtained for 622 African 5 to 11-year-olds compared with 669 Europeans, and a short-term memory IQ of 94 as the average of forward and backward digit span. Row 3 gives IQs for African 12 to 18-year-olds obtained from the Project Talent dataset and shows a relatively high IQ of 94 for immediate memory as compared with 89 for abstract reasoning. Row 4 gives an IQ of 94 for short-term memory for 5 to 9-year-old African Surinamese immigrants in the Netherlands compared with European children. The test consisted of the presentation of 10 drawings, each of which was given an arbitrary name, and the task was to remember as many of the names as possible. Row 5 gives IQs for African 6 to 16-year-olds, compared with Europeans of 82 for verbal ability, 78% for visualization ability, and a higher IQ of 90% for short-term memory measured by digit span. Row 6 gives an IQ of 94 for short-term memory for Africans obtained from a meta-analysis of 31 studies of children and adults. Row 7 gives IQs for a number of primary abilities from South Africa, from the study of 1,093 African and 1,056 European 16-year-olds, tested with the Junior Aptitude Test, a test constructed in South Africa that provides measures of abstract reasoning, verbal comprehension, visualization, short-term memory, and perceptual speed. The sample also obtained a mechanical ability IQ of 68. It will be seen that the African short-term memory IQ and the perceptual speed IQ are both higher than their abstract reasoning ability and their verbal reasoning ability, confirming the American studies. In this sample, the visualization and mechanical abilities are also all stronger than abstract and verbal reasoning ability. Row 8 gives a short-term memory IQ of 74 for a sample of 19,610-year-olds in Jamaica compared with 67 entered as the median of the 7 studies given in Table 4.3. Jensen has interpreted these and other results as showing that the African-European differences in intelligence are largely differences in Spearman's G. According to this theory, short-term memory and perceptual speed are weak measures of G, so Africans do relatively well on them. The theory has received considerable support, summarized by Rushton, but has also attracted some criticism from Dolan and Hamacher. Table 4.7. Primary abilities of Africans. 9. Musical abilities. It has often been considered that Africans have good musical abilities and a particularly strong sense of rhythm. The conclusion appears to have been first suggested in the 14th century by the Arab writer Ibn Butlan, who wrote that if an African were to fall from heaven to earth, he would beat time as he goes down. Musical abilities are associated with intelligence, so it is interesting to consider whether Africans have the good musical abilities often attributed to them, or poor musical abilities consistent with the low IQs they obtain on intelligence tests. Musical abilities are measured by simple tests such as the identification of pitch change, memory, chord analysis, and rhythm. The association between intelligence and musical ability has been shown in 2 studies carried out by Lynn, Wilson, and Galt. In the first, a sample of 21,710-year-olds were given a number of tests of reasoning, vocabulary, visualization, and perceptual speed abilities together with 4 musical ability tests. All the tests were positively intercorrelated and loaded on the first principal component as a measure of general intelligence. The loadings of the 4 musical tests lay between 0.45 and 0.59. This shows that the musical tests are measures of G. In the second study, 93 9 to 11-year-olds were given 3 tests of musical ability together with the standard progressive matrices, a measure of G. The 3 musical tests were significantly correlated with the progressive matrices at 0.27, 0.40, and 0.37. This confirms that musical ability is associated with intelligence. Further evidence for this association has been provided by Carroll. There has been some work on the musical ability of African Americans, but this is little known because it has not been summarized in general textbooks on intelligence, such as those of Brody and McIntosh, or in specialist textbooks on race differences in intelligence, such as those by Lolan, Lindsay, and Spuler and Jensen 1980. 1998. The general outcome of these studies is that African Americans perform less well than Europeans on tests of musical abilities of pitch discrimination, tone discrimination, and memory, but they perform about the same as Europeans on tests of rhythm. To show this pattern of musical abilities, the results of these studies have been aggregated to give a musical quotient derived from tests of musical ability other than rhythm, and a rhythm quotient. The results of these studies are summarized in Table 4.8. Row 1 gives results for a large sample of African Americans in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia calculated from the Seashore test and shows that they obtained an MQ of 90, but a higher RQ of 106. Row 2 gives results from a comparison of 272 European and 288 African American college students attending colleges in Tennessee, again showing that Europeans achieved higher scores on general musical ability, but African Americans achieved a higher RQ of 102. Row 3 gives results for a sample from a poor neighborhood in Washington, D.C., showing an MQ of 83 and an RQ of 96. Row 4 gives results for a sample of African American 5 to -8-year-olds in Rochester in New York State with an MQ of 89 and an RQ of 104. Row 5 gives results for a sample of African American 18-year-olds drawn from senior high school largely in Texas with some from Illinois and Rochester in New York State, with an MQ of 86 based on tonal memory and pitch discrimination, and an RQ of 100. The comparison group was 541 Europeans attending the same schools. All the studies show that African Americans have rhythm IQs substantially greater than general musical IQs by about 15 IQ points. There appears to be no change in the musical abilities of Africans over the period of approximately half a century from the 1920s to the late 1970s, over which the studies have been conducted. The relatively high rhythm ability of Africans is expressed in their music in which a strong rhythmic element is frequently present. This is notably the case in the hymns sung by congregations in African and African American churches. It also appears in jazz, which was first developed by African Americans in New Orleans in the early years of the 20th century, and in its subsequent development in swing, with its strong syncopated rhythms. Several twin studies have shown that there is a genetic basis for musical abilities. For instance, a study by Vandenberg of the heritability of rhythm ability obtained from the correlations of 33 pairs of identical twins and 43 pairs of same-sex fraternal twins calculated a heritability of 0.52. Table 4.8. Musical and rhythm quotients of African Americans, not corrected for measurement error. Heritabilities of this magnitude make it likely that the low general musical abilities and the high rhythm ability of Africans have some genetic basis. The low musical abilities of Africans, except for their strong sense of rhythm, are consistent with their generally poor achievements in classical music. There are no African composers, conductors, or instrumentalists of the first rank, and it is rare to see African players in the leading symphony orchestras. 10. Reaction times. Reaction times consist of the speed of reaction to a simple stimulus, such as the onset of a light. The task is to press a button when this occurs, and the reaction time is the time taken to respond, which typically takes about a third of a second. Numerous studies reviewed by Jensen and Deary have shown that reaction times are positively related to intelligence at a magnitude of around 0.2 to 0.3. It has been persuasively argued by Jensen that reaction times are a measure of the neurological efficiency of the brain in processing information. This makes it an interesting question whether the differences between Europeans and Africans in intelligence are also present in reaction times. If they are, it means that there are race differences in the efficiency of the brain. If there are not, it means that there are no race differences in the efficiency of the brain, and the differences in intelligence must be due to some other factors, such as opportunities for learning the problems in the tests, educational experiences, or test bias. The most complete studies of African-European differences in reaction times have been carried out by Jensen in the United States and Lin and Holmshaw and Sankey in South Africa. Jensen's study compared 585 European and 235 African 10-year-olds whose IQs assessed by the progressive matrices differed by 11 IQ points. The Lin and Holmshaw study compared 350 African and 239 British 9-year-olds whose IQs differed by 37 IQ points. Both studies used the same computer-controlled apparatus so that no human error can affect the times registered. Both studies measured the 12 components of reaction times. 3 different kinds of reaction time were measured. These were simple reaction time consisting of reactions to a single light, choice reaction time consisting of responses to one of 8 lights, and odd man reaction time consisting of reaction to the one of 3 lights that was farthest from the other 2. Each of these 3 reaction times was measured for 4 components consisting of the reaction time proper, the movement time, and the standard deviations of the reaction times and movement times. The results are shown in Table 4.9. Column 1 gives the different measures of reaction time. Columns 2 and 3 give the Jensen data for the correlation with the progressive matrices 1, Guatemalan Quetzal, and the D difference between Africans and Europeans with negative signs denoting faster times by Europeans. Columns 4 and 5 give the same data for the Lin and Holmshaw data. Correlations between reaction times and IQs are consistently positive in all the data, and 16 of the 24 correlations are statistically significant. But the correlations are very low. Reaction times shown in rows 1, 5, and 9 are faster in Europeans than Africans, except for CRT in the Jensen data. Simple movement times show no difference, but Africans are significantly faster than Europeans in both CMT and OMMT in the Lin and Holmshaw data. The faster movement times of Africans may be a factor in the fast sprinting speed of Africans shown in Olympic records. The standard deviations are consistently greater in Africans in the Lin and Holmshaw data, and in 4 of the 6 differences in the Jensen data. In general, the African-European differences are much greater and more consistent in the Lin and Holmshaw data than in the Jensen data. This would be expected because the intelligence difference is some 4 times greater in the Lin and Holmshaw data. However, in the Lin and Holmshaw data, the mean of differences of the 6 reaction times and standard deviations between the Africans and Europeans amounts to only 0.67D, as compared with a 2.5D difference in 1Q. The best interpretation of the results is that approximately a quarter of the African-European difference in intelligence may be explicable by the speed of neurological processing, while the remainder must be attributed to other processes. Although reaction times have a significant heritability of around 50%, they are also affected by nutrition. An Italian study found that children aged 6 to 10 in iodine-deficient villages had slower reaction times as well as lower IQs. Slow reaction times in children from iodine-deficient villages have also been reported by Bleichrodt et al. Table 4.9. Correlations between reaction times and IQ, and differences between Africans and Europeans in reaction times. Sanka has reported a study of 3 groups consisting of 26 illiterate Africans in South Africa aged 16, with only a few years of schooling, 29 African university students at Venda University in the northern Transvaal, and 30 European Dutch university students at Tilburg University. The three groups were given an intelligence test and simple and complex reaction time tasks, and an EEG measure was taken of the latency of the evoked potential to the presentation of the reaction time stimuli, a measure of the speed with which the stimulus is registered in the brain. There were equal numbers of males and females in all three groups. The results are shown in Table 4.10. Row 1 gives the IQs of the three groups. Row 2 gives the mean simple reaction times, showing slowest reaction times in the African illiterates and fastest in the European students. Row 3 gives complex reaction times, showing the same group differences. Row 4 gives the evoked potential latencies for task B1, showing longest latencies in the African illiterates and the shortest latencies in the European university students. All the group differences are statistically significant. Table 4.10. Reaction times and EEGs of Africans and Europeans. There are 6 points of interest in this study. First, the South African illiterate sample's progressive matrices IQ of 68 is closely similar to that of a large number of samples of Africans in South Africa and in other countries of sub-Saharan Africa. Second, the African university students have a somewhat higher IQ of 82, again similar to that of other South African university student samples. Third, there are significant differences between the three groups in reaction times, confirming other studies summarized in this chapter. Fourth, there are significant African-European differences in the EEG evoked potential, showing that in European students, the brain reacts more rapidly to a stimulus than in African students. Fifth, there is a statistically significant correlation of 0.213 between the complex reaction times and the progressive matrices, confirming many other studies of this association. 6. The correlation between the progressive matrices and the EEG evoked potential is not statistically significant. The differences between the African illiterates and the African students on reaction times and evoked potentials are probably attributable to the students having higher IQs. 11. Brain size of Africans and Europeans. Studies showing that Africans have smaller average brain size than Europeans are summarized in Table 4.1. The figures given in the table are in cubic centimeters. These figures have been converted from cubic inches, given by Morton and Gould, and from grams given by Ho et al. 1980. It should be noted that estimates of cranial capacities are to some degree affected by the method of measurement. The cranial volume of skulls is measured by filling them with lead shot or mustard seed and measuring the volume of the shot or seed. Lead shot gives slightly larger volumes than mustard seed because it cannot be compressed so tightly. For living humans, brain size is calculated from the length, breadth, and height of the head, or from the circumference. These different methods of measurement explain some of the differences obtained in the studies. Despite different methods of measurement, there is considerable consistency in the various studies. In Table 4.1, the results are given of 8 studies of the brain size of samples of Europeans and Africans, and the difference between the two means. All the studies show that Europeans have a larger average brain size than Africans. Row 1 gives the results of the first study showing that there are African-European differences in brain size published in the 19th century by the American physician Samuel Morton, who assembled a collection of skulls, categorized them by race, and calculated their average cranial capacities. His results were criticized by Gould, who accused him of massaging the figures to demonstrate that Europeans have larger brains than Africans. Gould recalculated Morton's skull sizes, and his results were closely similar. It is Gould's figures that are given in the table. He dismissed the 41 CCS difference as of no consequence. Gould characteristically failed to mention any of the other studies that all confirmed Morton's conclusions and found larger differences. Notice that the numbers of skulls in Morton's collection are quite low, consisting of 52 Europeans and 29 Africans, as compared with the other studies. Row 2 gives the results of an analysis of a much larger collection of skulls held at Western Reserve University in Ohio. showing 50 CCS African-European differences in brain size. Row 3 gives results presented by Tobias, a committed equalitarian, who asserted that there is no race difference in brain size, but whose results actually show a rather larger African-European brain size difference than those of Morton. Row 4 gives the results from autopsies in the United States showing a larger African-European difference of 103 cc's than in the other studies. Row 5 gives results from the largest collection of approximately 20,000 skulls from all over the world, analyzed by the American anthropologist Kenneth Beals. Row 6 gives results calculated by Groves by combining estimates of cranial capacities of 36 samples of males from figures given by Kuhn, Molnar, and Martin. And Saller, and again showing that Europeans have larger average brain size than Africans. Row 7 gives results for the United States for military personnel. These figures are adjusted for height and weight. The brain sizes of the Europeans are virtually identical to those found by Ho et al. Given in row 4, but the brain size of the Africans is much greater, at 1,359, as compared with 1,267. The explanation for this is that the U.S. military screens applicants for intelligence and rejects those with IQs below 81. Flynn has estimated that military rejection rates for low IQ are 3.4% for Europeans and 30% for Africans, and that the result of this is that Africans in the military have an average IQ of 91.5. The effect of not accepting Africans with low IQs is to screen out many of those with low intelligence and small brains, making the African-European brain size difference much smaller than in other samples. Row 8 gives average brain size of 6 samples of male Europeans from North America and Europe, and 2 samples from sub-Saharan Africa from data compiled by Jurgens, Ahn, and Pieper, and analyzed by Rushton, showing a European advantage of 109 cc's. The results in the 8 data sets all show greater brain size of Europeans than of Africans, and are reasonably consistent considering that they were compiled using different methods and different kinds of samples, including autopsies, skull volumes, and external head measurements of living individuals. These results are corroborated by a further large-scale study of children carried out by Broman, Nichols, Shaughnessy, and Kennedy. They examined and followed up approximately 17,000 European and 19,000 African children in the United States from conception to the age of 7 years. At the age of 7, there was the typical gap of approximately 15 IQ points between the two groups. The head circumference of the two groups calculated from the published data are 50.9 centimeters for Africans and 51.7 centimeters for Europeans. This difference is statistically highly significant and provides an approximate measure of differences in brain size since head circumference and brain size are correlated at about 0.8%. The brain volumes have been estimated by Rushton at 1,134 for Africans and 1,150 for Europeans. The difference is much smaller than in the other samples, possibly because Europeans mature later than Africans. In this study, the African children were slightly taller than the Europeans, suggesting that possible differences in nutrition are not likely to be responsible for the differences in head size. Table 4.1.1. Brain size of Europeans and Africans, 12. IQs of African-European hybrids. We now consider studies of the IQs of African-European hybrids. The prediction from the genetic theory of race differences is that the IQs of racial hybrids should fall approximately midway between those of Europeans and Africans. To examine this prediction, studies of African-European racial hybrids are summarized in Table 4.12. Row 1 gives results for Brazil showing that hybrids known as brown score intermediate between Europeans and Africans. Row 2 gives results from Germany from the Eifert study showing the IQ of African-European hybrid children was 94% in relation to 100% for European children. The mean IQ of the African-European hybrids was 96.5%, but is reduced in the table to 94% to allow for the secular increase of the IQ from the date of the standardization. Row 3 gives results from South Africa for Europeans, Africans, and coloreds, who are largely African-European, and shows that the IQ of 83 of the coloreds falls exactly halfway between that of Europeans and that of Africans. Row 4 gives results from a more recent study in South Africa collected approximately 60 years later, and showing a sample of coloreds with an IQ of 86 compared with an IQ of 100 for Europeans. Africans were not included in this study, but the IQ of 86 is much higher than that of pure Africans in South Africa. Row 5 gives results from a further South African study showing an IQ of 80 for coloreds. Rows 6 through 9 give 4 results for hybrids in the United States. Row 6 gives results from the Minnesota Transracial Adoption Study showing that hybrids score halfway between African Americans and Europeans. The numbers are very low, but the results are informative because all 3 groups were reared by European adoptive parents, and this rules out any reasonable environmental interpretation of the differences. Row 7 gives a further result from the United States showing once again that hybrids score intermediate between Europeans and African Americans. Row 8 gives another result from the United States that divided African Americans into dark-skinned and lighter-skinned, and showed that the lighter-skinned African Americans, taken as an index of hybridization with Europeans, have an IQ of 92, halfway between the Europeans and Africans. Row 9 gives the last result, showing that African American European hybrids have an IQ of 97, and again score intermediate between African Americans and Europeans. 13. Heritability of intelligence in African Americans. There have been 3 studies of the heritability of African Americans in the United States. They are all obtained from a comparison of identical and non-identical twins. The results are given in Table 4.13. This gives the age of the sample, the numbers of identical and non-identical twins, the correlations between the twin pairs, the heritability obtained by doubling the difference between the MZ and DZ correlations, and the corrected heritability, corrected for attenuation assuming a test reliability of 0.9. Row 1 gives data from Lolan, Lindsay, and Spuler, obtained from a doctoral dissertation by P.L. Nichols for 4-year-olds tested with the Stanford Binet. This shows a corrected heritability of 0.56, a little higher than that of Europeans of this age. Row 2 gives results of a further dataset from Osborne for general intelligence, calculated as the average of 12 tests, and showing a corrected heritability of 1. Row 3 shows data for the progressive matrices giving a corrected heritability of 0.60. Taken together, the 3 results show a heritability of 0.72 in African Americans and higher heritability in the 2 studies of adolescents than in the 4-year-olds. The heritabilities of the African Americans are virtually the same as those in Europeans given in Chapter 3. 14. Genetic and environmental explanations of TBE low African IQ. The problem of the genetic and environmental contributions to the low IQ of Africans has been debated since the early decades of the 20th century, particularly in regard to the problem of the low IQs obtained by African Americans in the United States. Many hundreds of papers and a number of books have been devoted to this problem, and it is not possible to deal with it adequately. 3 positions have been taken on this question. 1. The IQ difference between blacks and whites is wholly environmentally determined, or at least there is no compelling evidence for any genetic contribution to the low black IQ. This position has been taken by Flynn, McIntosh, Nisbet, Fish, Brody, and many others. 2. The IQ difference is determined by some mix of genetic and environmental factors. This position has been taken by Lolan, Lindsay and Spuler, Vernon and Waldman, Weinberg and Scar, who conducted one of the most important studies of this question involving the IQs of black children adopted by white couples. 3. The IQ difference is largely genetically determined. This position has been taken by Garrett, Girk, who showed that when blacks and whites were matched for socioeconomic status, blacks scored 7.5 IQ points below whites. Kuttner, who argued that black-white differences in intelligence were reflected in the differences in the building of early civilizations. Shuey, who made the first compilation of black-white IQ differences from 1916 up to 1965. Osborne and Mac Gurk, who made an updated compilation of Shuey's work covering the years 1966 to 1980, and Jensen, who has made numerous contributions to this issue and concluded that about 2/3 of the American black-white IQ difference is attributable to genetic factors. Others who have taken the largely genetic position are Shockley, Eysenck, Baker, Levin, Rushton, and the writer. There are 6 major arguments for the presence of some genetic determination of the intelligence difference between Africans and Europeans. First, the two races have evolved independently in different environments over a period of approximately 100,000 years. When two populations evolve largely in isolation from each other, for this period of time, genetic differences between them. Table 4.1. 3. Heritability of intelligence of African Americans inevitably evolve for all characteristics for which there is genetic variability. These differences evolve as a result of genetic drift, mutations, founder effects, and most important, adaptation to different environments. The extreme environmentalist position that there is no genetic difference between the two races for intelligence defies this general principle of evolutionary biology and should be ruled out as impossible. Second, the consistency with which Africans obtain low IQs in so many different locations can only be explained by the operation of a strong genetic factor. If only environmental factors were responsible for the different IQs of different populations, we should expect to find some countries where Africans had higher IQs than Europeans. The failure to find a single country where this is the case points to the presence of a strong genetic factor. Third, the high heritability of intelligence found in twin studies of blacks and whites in the United States, in Europe, Japan, and India shows that intelligence is powerfully affected by genetic factors and makes it improbable that the differences between Africans and Europeans, or between any other pairs of races, can be solely environmentally determined. Fourth, the brain size difference between blacks and whites points to a genetic difference, considering the high heritability of about 0.9% of brain size and the correlation of approximately 0.4% between brain size and intelligence. Fifth, several egalitarians have proposed that white racism may be responsible for impairing the IQs of the blacks. Thus, Weinberg, Scar, and Waldman write that their result, that black children adopted by whites have low IQs, could indicate the results of environmental influences, such as the pervasive effect of racism in American life, and the IQ results are consistent with racially based environmental effects in the order of group means. McIntosh also falls back on white racism in a final attempt to argue that the low IQ of the black adoptees can be explained environmentally, and suggests that perhaps it is precisely the experience of being black in a society permeated by white racism that is responsible for lowering black children's IQ scores. These egalitarians do not explain how hypothetical white racism could impair the IQs of black children reared by middle-class white parents. There is no known or plausible mechanism by which supposed white racism could impair the IQs of blacks, nor do they attempt to explain how it is that Africans throughout sub-Saharan Africa, who are not exposed to white racism, except in South Africa, have IQs of approximately 67%. Furthermore, if racism lowers intelligence, it is remarkable that Jews in the United States and Britain should have IQs of around 108, as shown in Lynn, since Jews have been exposed to some degree of racism for many centuries. The high IQ of American Jews has been well known since the 1930s and has been extensively documented by Storfer, MacDonald, and Herrnstein and Murray. Yet it goes curiously unmentioned by environmentalists like Flynn, Brody, Neisser, McIntosh, Jenks and Phillips, Nisbet, Montague, and Fish. Sixth, the Minnesota Transracial Adoption Study carried out by Waldman, Scar, and Weinberg was designed to show that when black infants are adopted by white parents, they would have the same IQs as whites. The authors of this study examined groups of black, white, and interracial babies, all adopted by white middle-class couples. In the event, it turned out that at the age of 17, the IQs were 89 for the blacks, 98% for the interracial, and 106 for the white. Thus, a 17 IQ point difference between blacks and whites remains when they are reared in the same conditions. Being raised by white adoptive parents had no beneficial effects on the intelligence of the black children, because their IQ of 89 is the same as that of blacks in the north-central states from which the infants came. The interracial group with its IQ of 98 falls midway between the black and the white, as would be predicted from the genetic cause of the difference. A full analysis and discussion of this study has been given by Levin and Lin, together with an unconvincing reply by Waldman, Weinberg, and Scar, in which they assert we feel that the balance of the evidence, although not conclusive, favors a predominantly environmental etiology underlying racial differences in intelligence, and that the burden of proof is on researchers who argue for the predominance of genetic racial differences. Notice that their use of the term predominantly environmental etiology concedes that they accept that genetic factors are also present. While the results of this study show that differences in family environment cannot explain the low black IQ, it remains possible that blacks provide an inferior prenatal environment as a result of poorer nutrition of pregnant black women, or possibly of the greater use of cigarettes, that might impair the growth of the fetal brain. These possibilities are rendered improbable by studies showing that the nutrition of American blacks throughout the 20th century was not inferior to that of whites. Another possibility is that black babies might suffer greater impairment of the brain because pregnant black women might smoke cigarettes more, since there is some evidence that smoking retards fetal growth. But this is rendered improbable by numerous studies showing that blacks smoke cigarettes less than whites. Despite their commitment to the egalitarian position, it is interesting to note that Waldman, Scar, and Weinberg conclude that their evidence shows that both genetic and environmental differences contribute to the black-white IQ difference. We think it is exceedingly implausible that these differences are either entirely genetically based or entirely environmentally based. Thus, while there is nothing in their data that can justify this conclusion, because they provide no evidence for any environmental contribution to the low black IQ, their final position is not greatly different from that advanced by Jensen, that both genetic and environmental factors are responsible for the low black IQ. But where Jensen proposed that the relative contributions are about 2/3 genetic and 1/3 environmental, Waldman, Scar, and Weinberg have concluded that both factors are involved, although they do suggest a quantification of the magnitude of the respective contributions. In fact, the results of the Minnesota interracial adoption study show that both conclusions are incorrect. The conclusion to be drawn from this study is that rearing black children in a white middle-class environment has no effect at all on their IQs at age 17. 15. Estimation of TBE genotypic African IQ. The IQs of approximately 67% of the African populations of sub-Saharan Africa shown in Table 4.1 are a function of both genetic and environmental factors. We now undertake the task of estimating the genotypic African IQ. This is the IQ that Africans would have if they were raised in the same environment as Europeans. The starting point of this analysis is the Minnesota Transracial Adoption Study, the results of which are summarized in Section 14, and which showed that a 17 IQ point difference between African Americans and Europeans is still present when they are reared in the same family environments. The conclusion to be drawn from this is that the African American European IQ difference in the United States is wholly genetically determined. Although this study showed a 17 IQ point African European IQ difference, it is reasonable to assume that the true African American European difference is 15 IQ points, as shown by the numerous studies summarized in Table 4.4, and that the 17 IQ point difference obtained in this study is a sampling error. We conclude, therefore, that the genotypic IQ of African Americans is 15 IQ points below that of American Europeans, A further argument for believing that the IQ of African Americans is wholly genetically determined is that it has remained constant over a period of approximately 80 years, despite the great improvements in the environment of African Americans relative to that of Europeans. The conclusion that African Americans have a genotypic IQ of 85 does not mean that Africans in sub-Saharan Africa also have a genotypic IQ of 85. African Americans are not pure Africans, but are a hybrid population with a significant amount of European ancestry. This has been estimated at 25% by Reed and by Chakraborty, Cambo, Nwamko, and Farrell. We can estimate that pure Africans in Africa and in the United States have a genotypic IQ of 80 and that this IQ increases by 0.2 IQ points for every 1% of Caucasoid genes. Thus, the average African American will have an IQ of 85, a figure confirmed by numerous studies summarized in Table 4.4. In the southeastern states, the percentage of European genes among African Americans is quite low. For instance, in South Carolina, it has been estimated at 6%, and in Georgia at 11%. These admixtures of European genes should raise their IQ by 1.2 and 2.2 IQ points, respectively, giving them an IQ of 81.2 and 82.2. This prediction has been confirmed by the study of 1,800 African Americans in 5 southeastern states by Kennedy, Van der Riet, and White, which found their IQ on the 1960 Stanford Binet was 80.7%. African Americans with 50% European genes will have an IQ of 90% equal to 90. This is about the mean IQ of African Americans in the northern states, where the proportion of European ancestry approaches 50%. African Americans with 75% European genes will have an IQ 15 points higher at 95 to 95, which is very close to the IQ of 94% of the interracial children in the Minnesota Transracial Adoption Study. Europeans with 100% European genes will have an IQ at 100. This estimate of the genotypic African IQ as 80 means that the average IQ that Africans would obtain if the environments in which they were raised were the same as those of Europeans would be 80%. Throughout sub-Saharan Africa, the mean IQ of Africans is approximately 67%. So it can be inferred that adverse environmental conditions in sub-Saharan Africa impair the African IQ by around 13 IQ points.